Over the years, the way that Fulbrighters have crossed the Atlantic has shifted. What once took days of sailing on an ocean liner now takes mere hours in the sky. As part of our 75th anniversary celebrations, we decided to sit down with 2024-25 US Fulbright scholar Roy Grundmann, whose Fulbright research project happens to focus on ocean liners. Thanks to Roy, we were able to learn more about when and why the shift from maritime to aerial crossings happened for Fulbrighters, and to delve deeper into the general history of the ocean liners that once carried them across the Atlantic.
For the first 20 years, Fulbright put its fellows on ships. So grantees from 1950, from the very first hour until early 1970, took the ship to Europe. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that in the 50s, ship travel was pretty much the only way in which you could cross the Atlantic. It is true that commercial flights started to happen and increase by the early 1950s, but it was tedious to cross the Atlantic by plane. The second reason was that it was cheaper. So even when jet travel took over in the 1960s and ocean liners slowly started to fade away as a major means of travel, they were still preferred by an organization like Fulbright because they were more economical. It was simply cheaper to put grantees on ships than to make them fly. This may sound a little bit strange because we associate ocean liners with glamour, luxury, high-end travel, but that's not necessarily true because ocean liners, especially the big ones, had a class system, so you had different fares available. And needless to say, Fulbright did not make their grantees travel first class. We know that much. So it ended up being more economical and cheaper for them to put grantees on ships than to make them fly. Why did this change in 1969-70? The main reason is that at that point, the ships no longer were available to the extent that Fulbright needed them to be available on a regular schedule, because by that time, ocean liners were mainly turned into cruise ships and were withdrawn from transatlantic travel to do the regular crossings. It just became economically unsustainable for the shipping lines that were operating them. The main reason was not necessarily the cost, because even all through the 1960s, flying remained very, very expensive. But it became economically unsustainable to run ocean liners into the 1970s because you had the oil crisis, and most ocean liners ran on crude oil. And by the early 70s, it just was too expensive to operate them on a regular transatlantic schedule. So they all were either retired or were turned into cruise ships.
When it comes to speed, flight clearly has the advantage over sailing, but the slower pace of crossing the Atlantic on an ocean liner nevertheless offered certain advantages to the program participants embarking on their Fulbright experience.
When you're on a ship as a cohort, it has tremendous advantages because you get to know one another before you actually get to the country of destination. And you can already start to network, you can have bonding experiences, you can get to know people, you can start to reflect on the whole trip, on the whole 6 months ahead of you. So all of those aspects were things that ship travel offered that plane travel obviously didn't and would not going forward.
A trip through the archives isn't just about the data. The files can also reveal insights into program participants' individual experiences.
I do know that the fellows fully enjoyed the ship travel, and how could you not? There's one file that I found where a grantee from, I believe, the late 1950s kept as a souvenir a music program, a music evening on the SS Independence, which is one of the ships that Fulbright used, with classical music. And of course, those kinds of music programs were done on all ships. That was part of the onboard evening entertainment. But I understand why it might have held special significance for that particular grantee, because He was on a project related to music, and he was actually a music scholar.
The choice between flying and sailing isn't just logistical, it's emotional. And Roy has a personal preference.
I always prefer to sail, to this day. And in fact, I'm returning to the US by ship. Sailing is a lot more interesting, I think. It's more dignified than flying. To me, flying is kind of like a modern cattle drive. It's very uncomfortable. You're very much disciplined the whole time. There's a lot of uncertainty related to it. There's a lot of stress. Getting to the airport, boarding the plane, being on the plane, making it through turbulences, sitting in uncomfortable seats, eating inferior food, if you get any food at all, getting to the other side, and the whole rigmarole. So I think ship travel is infinitely more preferable to plane travel.
In the years that Fulbright program participants traveled by sea, they primarily traversed the Atlantic on the SS Constitution or the SS Independence, two ships that also have a unique place in US history.
So the Constitution and her sister ship, the Independence, were American-built liners, which was a big deal because the US traditionally was not big on passenger shipbuilding. The US had no real history of passenger ship operation. Whatever ships the US ran before World War II were ships that they had acquired as war reparations. And so after the war, when the need arose for more travel between the US and Europe, the US didn't want to once again let the Europeans take over the market, which is what traditionally had happened. Even the migration to the US from the 1880s on, and any kind of passenger ship travel before World War II was mostly done by European operators. You know, the big lines like the Italian line, the North German Lloyd, Cunard and White Star. Those were the big operators of the big ocean liners. And the US was basically just the recipient of the people who came over. And the Constitution and the Independence were mid-sized ships. They weren't massive liners like the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth. They were mid-sized ships, and they were used on the so-called Sun Lane. Now, the Sun Lane was the route that went from New York into the Mediterranean, whereas Cunard went obviously from the UK with a stop in France over to New York on the North Atlantic. Constitution and Independence went the southern route and competed with the Italian line by going to Italian ports, Genoa, Naples, and also, I think, on the way back to Lisbon. And you can tell by the way those ships are designed, there's lots of deck space. They kind of really flatten out towards the aft so that people had enough space to be on deck and be in deck chairs. So they were already kind of designed for the leisure cruise market.
Given that Roy's research project focuses on ocean liners, Austria, a landlocked country, may seem an odd choice. Yet Austria's past makes it a relevant destination to delve into the topic.
My Fulbright project is officially called Ocean Liners as Vehicles of Cultural Exchange. And why Austria? Why is Austria a desirable place for me to research that topic? And the answer is that Austria, number one, has a rich ocean liner tradition. You would say, well, how is that possible? Austria is landlocked. Well, Austria, of course, was not always landlocked. Up until the end of World War I, Austria was a big maritime power with a navy and with ocean liners, because at that point, the port of Trieste, which is now Italy or has been Italy for a long time, was part of the Austrian Empire. And so a certain amount of immigration to the US from Austria went through the port of Trieste, even though the majority still went north, went through the German port cities of Hamburg and Bremerhaven to emigrate to the US. But a certain amount went through Trieste. You had Austrian shipping dynasty, the Kosulich family, that built ship routes or organized ship routes from the Mediterranean to the US and also to other countries on the other side of the Mediterranean. So Austria absolutely has a tradition of ocean travel. of ocean liners and of transatlantic travel. Austria also has a cultural tradition of cultural memory and writing about ships. We have the Austrian author Stefan Zweig, whose book Schachnovelle or Chess Novella is significantly set on an ocean liner. Austria also lays claim, like other countries do, to Franz Kafka. One of Kafka's key works is Der Verschollene, or also called America, which is set on a ship. Also now we have contemporary filmmakers like Georg Wasener, for instance, who has made a wonderful film about the Titanic sinking. And he's Austrian. He works for the Austrian Film Museum. So Austria is actually not a bad place to research that kind of stuff.